So what's the deal with railroad switches? Yeah, we're talking about another basic element of the railroads, but like any basic element of anything, it's a surprisingly complicated and deep topic. Because there are many different kinds, but they all amount to effectively the same thing. Moving trains off the track they're on to a different track. Usually. Sometimes it's not a track, but more on that later. And to begin with, not everyone calls them switches. We call them switches here in America, but some places call them turnouts or points. Regardless, they all refer to the same thing, the switch, which moves the designated path from one track to another. The most common method for doing this consists of two linked tapering rails. These are either called points, or switch rails, or point blades, and they lie between the outer normal rails that the train is running on. The points can be moved laterally back and forth, depending on which path the train is supposed to take, into one of two different positions. Based on that, it'll direct the train in accordance to, well, whatever line it's lined up with. A train heading towards a switch, in a way that will cause the switch to actually direct it onto a different line, is known as a facing point movement. If they're coming the other way, well, the points generally don't affect it. It'll move through them regardless, in a trailing point movement. The train will absolutely move the point out of the way if it's set wrong. And most modern switches are set up to allow for this type of movement without damaging the actual mechanism, and they're called trailable switches. Older ones don't necessarily allow for this, though it will still, in all likelihood, happen, and it can damage the switch. So generally, regardless of which direction the train is coming from, if it's an old school switch that is not set up to handle this, it's important for it to be set properly, regardless of whether or not it's actually, moving the train to a different line. Generally speaking, the switch will have a straight through track, and then there's a diverging route onto a secondary track. Sometimes this split is into two sets of rails that are together a main line for different directions. Of course, there's also yard switches, which get really complicated really quickly. If you want to find switches, the best place to be is a rail yard. And by that I mean don't go there at all, you're not allowed there, that's trespassing, don't do that. But there's generally a ton of switches in yards, because, well, yards need to move a lot of stuff around and reorient trains and set up different trains and the whole shebang, and this results in many switches, and if you're in Australia, even different rail gauges. So, things get pretty complicated pretty quick. In the early days of railways, before actual modern locomotives, single-bladed switches were used because the railways were wood, and a single blade was perfectly acceptable for this. As time progressed and iron-railed plateways started being a thing, cast iron components were made to build switches with check rails. Different patents were established over the years for different techniques to move switches, or different shapes and sizes and things of that nature. We don't need to get super detailed in this video, but there's a lot of variation between switches, even though they all effectively do the same thing. There are different methods for moving it, and in the modern day, a lot of switches aren't manually controlled. They're automatic, from signal boxes far away from the switches, sometimes miles out. This is another reason why it's very important, and I can't stress this enough, to not trespass on the friggin' railway tracks, and definitely don't trespass in an area with switches. Switches are one of the most common ways for accidents to happen, for two reasons. A, because most switches in the modern day aren't manually controlled and moved from miles away electronically, well, if you were to put your foot in between the switch and the rail, and at the same time someone decided to move said switch, you are stuck, your foot is crushed, and you cannot move until a train comes along and just lops off your leg, and it's really not a pleasant situation for anybody involved, especially not you. The other issue is that do not, if they are manual switches, do not touch them, ever, under any circumstances. That is asking to cause an accident. Even if you're just messing around, seriously, you're gonna get somebody killed. Do not do this. Doubtless many of you recall a video I made, and many other people did, about a YouTuber who caused an accident just to film it on a railway. He did this by messing with a switch. That's exactly what he did. So, seriously, don't touch them. Don't go near them. Don't even look at them. Okay, you could probably look at them from a safe distance, but just don't mess with the frickin' switches, okay? There are several different components that go into most switches. There are the switch rails, which are arguably the primary component. They're the movable bit, the rails that move back and forth to actually do the switching. Most of these are tapered, though at least one kind isn't. Again, more on that later. But there are other components to an effective switch. There's the crossing, sometimes called a frog. This part of the switch enables passage of wheels on either route through the turnout. Basically, allowing a train to cross over to a different line without actually, impeding on that line or damaging that line. That's what a frog is, or a crossing, whatever you want to call it. There's guardrails, or check rails. Why does everyone use different terminology? Could we just standardize what we call things? No, of course we can't, because this is mostly between America and the UK, and we can't agree on anything. They call them lifts, we call them elevators, they call it tea, we call it lunch. They make steak and kidney pie, and then we sit there wondering who hurt them so badly that they thought putting kidneys in pies was a good idea, and then remember it was probably us when we rebelled, so hey, that's fair. The point is we don't agree on simple, stupid things, and this is one of them. But a guardrail is a short piece of rail that's placed alongside the main rail on the opposite side of the crossing. The reason for this is to make sure that the wheels follow the appropriate flangeway through the frog. Because if they don't, the train will derail, and that's bad. We don't want it to do that, for obvious reasons. Then there's a switch motor or switch machine. Now, this is situational. It depends on whether this is an old school switch or a more modern switch. Old school switches were pretty much all manual, but if this is an automatic switch, it will have some kind of motor mechanism. It either works electronically, hydraulically, or pneumatically in some cases, and these are the kind of switches that are usually controlled from miles away. But they can be operated manually in case of power failures or other malfunctions, generally with what's called a switch stand, or points lever, or ground throw, if you want to also call it that. Again, multiple terminologies, I'm over it. This is a manual lever, specifically to move the switch back and forth. They are deceptively heavy, and it doesn't matter, because never touch them. For any reason. On top of this, there are also facing point locks, or FPLs, sometimes called point locks. These devices ensure that the points of the switch are in the correct position, as well as locking them in place. This is a safety mechanism. If a switch isn't completely in place, it can, in and of itself, cause a train to derail. They also prevent, potentially, a train in a facing movement from forcing the switch apart. Something that is pretty rare, but it can happen, unless there's an FPL installed, in which case it's much, much less likely. However, it is worth saying that FPLs are one of the reasons why certain switches can be damaged if a train in a trailing movement passes straight through them. This is known as a run-through, and it can damage the switch. But again, a lot of modern switches are modified to prevent damage from happening, but you still don't really want run-throughs, because the switches should be aligned either way, but yeah, that's a thing. There are joints, which are used where moving points meet the fixed rails of the switch. They're basically just the hinges that allow the switch to move back and forth. Pretty simple. And switches can be straight and or curved. This varies. In the early days, pretty much all of them were just straight, and pointed at the end for a sharp angle. But because they were straight, this did cause a bump whenever a train went through them. And for passenger trains, that was rough, and they were trying to fix that, so the switching rails were made curved, providing a smoother ride. The problem here, though, is that the metal used for the curve was a lot thinner, and, as a result, weaker. A solution to this was found in Germany in the 1920s. They started using a different rail profile for the stock rails and the switch rails. The switch rails would be 25 millimeters less in height when compared to the regular rails. This allowed them to be a bit wider, while still maintaining a smoother ride, and therefore giving us the best of both worlds. As a result, the vast majority of switches you'll see in the modern day are curved, because it is smoother at the end of the day, and modern innovation has allowed for the strength to be retained without having to make the rail straight. But there are different kinds of switches, because of course there are. There are many, many, many different kinds of switches, in fact, and we'll go over quite a few of them. The first type is the double slip switch, or just the double slip. This is technically a combination of switches that's a narrow-angled diagonal flat crossing. of 2 different lines. This is combined with 4 pairs of points. The result is that there's 4 different routes to pick from, which is pretty convenient, especially in a yard setting. But there's also single slips. In a single slip setup, there's only one switching possibility, and is arguably the simplest kind of switch, since either you go to the other line or you don't. That's it. It's just the one switch. Then there are outside slips. These are funny. An outside slip is very similar to the previous slip types, except that the blades of the switch are on the outside of the diamond instead of on the inside. Why would you want to do this? Well, one of the advantages over it is that trains can pass over the slips at much higher speeds. However, they do have a downside, in that they take up way more room, meaning they aren't used in yards basically ever. These are only really used on main lines and on higher speed areas, and they can be double slipped if you want, but that's pretty unusual. There are crossover switches. These switches occur in an area of double track, and basically allow a train to connect to the adjacent track should they wish to cross between them. Then there are stub switches. These are funny. Real funny. Because they're stubs. They got stubs. They don't have any points. Where are the points? Why are you so stubby? Well, the idea of the stub switch, basically, both movable rails and the ends of the rails of the diverging route have their ends cut off square. The switch mechanism aligns the movable rails with the rails of one of the diverging routes. So instead of crossing over the switch technically, it's basically realigning the track entirely. But in order to make this work, the stub switches aren't secured to sleepers, ties, at all. They can't be, because they have to move, and the whole point of the ties is to make sure the tracks don't move. So, you know. They also have to be lighter than regular rails, less sturdy, to allow some more flexibility when they move, which effectively means these could never be used on any kind of high-speed rail network, because rails of a high-speed rail network absolutely have to be made of really good materials, because, well, then they'll break, and then horrible things happen. We don't want that. And on top of that, they have many other disadvantages. A run-through, coming from the opposite end and running through misaligned points on this type of switch, technically can't happen, because it won't run through anything, because it'll just derail. So that's one big issue, is that these have to be aligned. You can't even get a run-through without a derailment. But on top of that, in hot weather, expansion of the steel of the rails causes the movable set of rails to stick to the stock rails, making switching impossible until the rails cool off. But on the flip side, in cold weather, they're actually quite useful, because snow tends to get in the way of more traditional switches, simply because it can jam them. Too much snow buildup will cause the switches to not be able to move to the correct position, and then you'd get a misaligned switch and possibly a derailment. It's not good. But stub switches don't have to worry about this because of the way they work. They just push the snow out of the way. So, in certain areas of the world with that particular climate issue, like the far north, they do offer that particular benefit. There are three-way switches. These are fun, and they're exactly what they sound like. They're a single switch, technically, but they allow the train to go to 3 different sections of track. Very exciting. And within three-way switches, there are actually 2 different varieties. Oh yes, there are sub-types of this particular type of switch. One is called a symmetrical three-way switch, with the left and right branches diverging at the exact same place. And then there's an asymmetrical three-way switch, in which the branches aren't at the same place, they're staggered. But both types require 3 different frogs. And because of their nature, and their use basically only ever being in yards, because otherwise, no, they generally require severe speed restrictions. These sets of switches were very popular in Switzerland for a long time, though in the modern day they've fallen out of favor pretty much everywhere. They have higher maintenance costs due to their specialized components and design, and if railroads can get away with it, they prefer to use 2 standard switches over the 3-ways, just because they're easier to manage. And within 3-ways, there's also stub 3-ways. They're stub switches, but they have 3 ways. These are most often found on very cheaply built railroads like logging railroads, just because they were easier to make in the first place. There are plate switches. These combine the taper points of a regular old switch into a self-contained plate. Now why the heck would you want to do that? Well, they're only used for double-flanged wheels, and each point blade is moved separately by hand. So these are not seen very often at all. They are not a commonly utilized concept. There are interlaced turnouts. These get crazy. These are insane. They're a method of splitting the track into 3 or more divergent paths, but in an interlaced setup. The points of the second turnout are positioned between the points and the frog of the first turnout. And if that sounds really confusing, it's because it can. Even for the railroads, it is one of the most confusing things they have to build, and they try to avoid it if they can. They're only seen in areas with both a whole heck of a lot of trains coming through on a daily basis, as well as a lack of space. And basically, big city stations. That's where you see these, and you see them a lot there. And nowhere else, because if they can get away with not making these things, they will. Next we have Y switches. Or Y points. These types of switch diverge symmetrically in 2 opposite directions. It's basically literally a fork in the road. Or a fork in the track, actually. And here in America, they're also sometimes called equilateral switches or equilateral turnouts. I don't call them that because that's a lot more syllables than just saying why. So I don't know why we do that. And because they're more symmetrical, they actually have less of a curve involved when it comes to switching, meaning that they have less severe speed restrictions. So this could be nice whenever you're going from a single line out of the yard to a double-tracked main line. Beyond that, there are runoff points. These are weird. Well, they're not weird. They're only switches in the very technical sense. They are switches, but they switch to nothing. They basically intentionally derail the train, or at least put them on a very sturdy siding. And the intention behind them is to actually stop runaway cars, or even hold trains that are passing signals set at danger. Modern ones are automatically set to, if a train were to pass a signal set of danger without slowing down at all, to immediately switch and intentionally derail that train before it gets to a main line, because a controlled, predicted derailment is much better than a major accident, because at least they know where the train's going to come off the rails, you know? They're sometimes called catch points, and they are a safety feature. By extension, derailers could be called a type of switch, but they're the same thing as runoff points, except they're portable, and can put them anywhere. They technically do become a switch in that way, but they're movable, and their only purpose is to throw a train off the rails. In case, well, one's running away, and they want it to stop, but they can't stop it, so they're like, okay, fine, we'll derail it, at least in a place where it'll do the least amount of damage. But what about dual-gauge switches? Australia! To which my Australian fanbase replies, why are you always picking on us, mate? And to them I say, you know what you did! Dual-gauge switches only exist in places where there are more than one gauge that has to pass through a certain area. Multi-gauge yards, for example, that were particularly prevalent historically in Australia, would have had to have dual-gauge switches because they had dual-gauge yards. You see the problem here. Rack railway switches are neat, as are rack railways in general. Should probably make a whole video explaining rack railways, but real quick, a rack railway is a very, very steeply graded railway. A normal conventional railway can't handle grades that are beyond a certain point. Generally about 3% is like the absolute max, unless your name is a Shay, in which case you might be able to handle up to 5 or 6% tops. But the point is, beyond that, it's not going to happen. Rack railways have a set of rails, but in the middle is a toothed track. In the center of the locomotives that work on a racked railway, they have a cog. And this cog fits into that toothed track and lets them basically climb it like a ladder up these steep grades. It's pretty neat. Not gonna lie. But naturally, the switches on such a railway have to be a bit more distinctive than on a conventional one. Even the rack railways will only put their switches on relatively flat areas of their network, because trying to do that in the middle of a very steep grade is a really stupid friggin' idea, and they're well aware of that. And they vary in terms of how they do it, because some railways only have the cog bit, or pinion, powered on their locomotives. And in that case, the rack portion of the rails has to go fully through the switches, otherwise the train can't traverse it. But on other cog railways, the outside wheels are also powered, and in that case, they can actually drop the rack just for the switch. But in places where they have to use the rack all the way through the switch, like on the Dolderbahn Railway in Switzerland, all 3 rails are bent to allow the train to switch between the tracks. There are single point switches, sometimes called tongue and plane mate switches, and they are exactly what they sound like. They only use a single point. They're a little unusual on mainline railroads, but are sometimes seen in very slow speed operation. But on streetcar systems, or trams, they're actually a bit more common, because on trolleys, trams, streetcars, whatever you want to call them, both sides of the car are connected by a rigid solid axle. Because of this, only one switch point is actually needed to steer it onto one or the other track, and it's cheaper to only use one point. And streetcars, especially in the middle of the city, aren't moving very fast, so single points are totally reasonable for them. Then there are rotary switches. Oh boy! What the heck is that? Okay, that's a thing. Well, these are another thing that's often seen on rack railways, or cog railways, if you want to call them that too. And these are used to maintain alignment of the cog with 2 different tracks. This kind of switch actually rotates about its axis to present a connection to a chosen set of tracks. Basically, it flips completely over, and as a result of this very bizarre method, the cog alignment is preserved in both positions. The reason they do it this way is basically because both lines are going to completely different elevations, and you can't just move it sideways and have the rack be straight. It just doesn't work. But if you rotate it and have 2 different rack heights on either side of the rails, that allows it to be able to function in this manner. It's really weird and really specific. You don't see it anywhere but cog railways, but it's pretty cool. And lastly, and these barely count, but I'll bring them up anyway, there's temporary points. These are exactly what they sound like. It's just a temporary switch, generally only seen on tram railways because of construction. Certain areas are shut down for maintenance or whatever it may be. The trams can't pass through there, but can pass on the adjacent track. So they create a temporary switch to allow them to move over and go around the construction. They're generally removed once the construction is complete. And it's hard to even call them a switch. Well, I mean, they are a switch, but they're almost always not movable at all, because there's no reason to. They're generally welded into place to prevent that exact thing from happening, because while the construction's going on, they literally can't go on the track they're switching from. So they put them solidly into place until they can be removed later. Oh, that was a lot. I told you, I was not playing about the switches. There are so many things to talk about with switches. Switching trains, that's what we do, okay? And it's very important. It's probably one of the most important functions of railroading, because, well, you can't really run a railroad very effectively if there's only one piece of track. I mean, I guess you can do it if you got 1, maybe 2 trains, but, like, if they have to switch eventually. They have to go around each other if you have more than 1. And, I mean, you have to be able to turn them around, and, look, switches are very, very important. And switch management is very important, which is why I stress again, don't touch them. Don't go near them. Don't mess with the dang switches, okay? There are so many historical train accidents that were caused due to switch mismanagement. And I don't think any of you want to be a part of one of those. So please, let the railroads do railroad things and keep track of their switches and make sure they're always in the right place. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.